Can't
3
force,
times.
can't force it if they like. To go, we're ready to go. So for the benefit of those folks who have not been here, and I see a lot of familiar faces, I think you've probably all been here for the other presentations. But for those at home, we do have some new folks, I think, that are viewing it on YouTube. Some of our state regulators are actually tuning in and listening. I did send the report to them as well so that they, or the presentation to them as well. So they got to preview it. I don't want to steal Pete's thunder, so I won't talk a lot, but what I will say is this is the last public presentation that we'll do. It is, I just got to get a little closer maybe. This is the last public presentation that we'll do. Pete's in the process of writing everything up into a full report. He's going to talk about that process and what I think his expectations are, but I will just say that it's important for that report always stay front and center for the community to make sure that that stays front and center. And as commissioners we have turnover, and as we have turnover of management, that thing is really important to always have cast in stone so that you continue your roadmap to 2040. If you let that die, who knows where we'll end up in 2040. But thank you for coming, Pete. Brenna's from the Island Institute. She's back as well. I think you were here one other meeting. Yeah. So thank you, everybody. Pete, we're excited to hear what you have to say.
All right.
I will say up front, this thing has reaffirmed some things that I knew. It helped me open my eyes to some other possibilities. But I really like the results and we're excited to hear what you have to say.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. I appreciate it. Hello, everyone. I'm really excited you're here. It's 4 o'clock. It's a really nice day out. And there's no free food or free booze. So I'm really impressed that you showed up for this. So thank you. Like I said, my name is Peter Kappers. I'm with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. This is the last presentation of a series of work that we've done. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But ultimately, my goal here is sort of have you all walk away with a better sense of sort of based on the objectives you all talked to me about, the Block Island Utility District team talked about, hopefully you walk away with a sense of, okay, what could 2040 look like? And how do we make some trade-offs around what that future could look like? Because ultimately, like you said, you're a cooperative utility. You all get to decide ultimately, the direction you want to take that utility in. And so hopefully through this analysis, you begin to better understand some of those key trade-offs that can be made. As I go through the presentation, please do not hesitate to sort of stop me and ask questions. I may table things if we sort of get way too down in the weeds for most people. I'm assuming a lot of you don't have a deep, robust background, so you probably don't want to know about intricate assumptions that went into the analysis. But that being said, as Jeff mentioned, there is some of that discussion in here, but more importantly, there'll be a report that fully documents all of that to be as transparent as possible about the inputs and assumptions we made. We vetted all of them with the utility district folks, so feel confident that they at least represent, their expectations and understanding of what the future could look like. We've used a lot of nationally recognized sources for this analysis from other labs of, ours, other national sources as well. So with that, let me get started. If I can figure out how to advance my own slides, that would be good. Okay, so here is a rough agenda of sort of what I want to cover. I'm going to really try and get through this in about an hour and 15, an hour and a half. If you have been to these in the past, you know that I have a tendency to talk fast and talk a lot. So I'm going to try and slow down, but at the same time also get through this. So hopefully you're not here all the way until 6 o'clock. But I am happy to talk about this as long as anybody wants. So let me just give you a brief background of who I am and why I'm here. We'll talk a little bit about the ETIP project in particular, what it is, and sort of how you all as a community came to this program. I'm going to lay a brief foundation for the electric grid. I feel like there's some basic information that folks need to understand in order to put the context of the final set of results in here, this energy roadmap to 2040, into really put it into the proper context. You can understand some of these key trade-offs if you understand some of these elemental ways in which the grid operates writ large, but also some of the unique aspects of the Block Island grid, because there are some unique elements to it. And that'll be it for today. So quickly, who am I? I am actually a native New Englander. I was born up in Rockland, Maine, to spend some time down in the Massachusetts area, and ultimately ended up going to college out in Syracuse and largely never left upstate New York. I met my wife there. She happens to be come from a very large Greek family, actually from the old country, both of her folks in an arranged marriage. So if you've ever seen my Big Fat Greek Wedding, that was my life. To this day, we have a massive Big Fat Greek family. And I have 3 kids, one of which is graduated college about a week ago. Another one is a sophomore in college at Syracuse University, and I have a senior who's just graduating high school in about a month and is also heading off to SU. So that's me. I've worked at the National Lab for about 18 years and have been with the Energy Transition Energy Technology Innovation Partnership Program since its inception back in, I think it was 2019, 2020, somewhere around that time period. So this is a technical assistance program that was stood up by the Department of Energy with money to send out to 4 different national labs to provide help like this to communities interested in, charting their own course from an energy standpoint. And so we have a bunch of regional partners represented today by Brenna from the Island Institute. They're based also out of Rockland, Maine, which I still think is sort of ironic. But they are the regional partner here. They have strong connections with communities up and down New England's coastline. And so really excited to kind of be able to work with her on this project over the last year and a half. So how did you all come to ETIP? Well, you had some folks on your board who basically filed an application for technical assistance. John and Barbara put in their application, the things about this community that they wanted help with. They identified a bunch of challenges. First and foremost being, it's wonderful that you have this relatively new undersea cable that allows you to bring electricity in from the bulk power system on the mainland. Allows you to move off of diesel generators to serve all of your load, instead needing it only as backup. But on the flip side, it means that you need those diesel generators for backup in the event of a cable outage. And so what do you do from a reliability standpoint? What if those diesel generators go down? What are your alternative options? And so there's reliability implications with those diesel generators as backup, but there's also cost implications associated with them. So these are 2 very real challenges that they wanted to try and better understand what their options were looking forward to either phase out the undersea cable itself or what kind of resiliency and reliability resources could supplant or replace those diesel generators. And also, you all are on the forefronts of sea level rise. And so what role could you play in trying to support broader decarbonization efforts? And so from a priority standpoint of ETIP, we wanted, what we heard from you was you wanted to further investigate some options for alternative energy sources and storage systems here on the island. But they also are really interested in trying to really engage you all in a broader conversation about what the future could look like. And so what we did is a couple of roles and responsibilities here in terms of the team that was created. Largely the most important thing I think to identify here is technical team, that's us at Berkeley Lab. We've got our regional partner here, which is sort of the conduit. I don't know Block Island. I've been here once or twice for a wedding, but the Island Institute really helps us kind of better connect and bridge between the utility district and your community with me as a technical resource. And then we've got National Renewable Energy Laboratory is overall leading the ETIP project. So on this particular project, we talked to the folks at the utility district, then came out and talked to you, and ultimately identified 3 key things that this project should pursue. First and foremost was a community energy awareness capacity building effort. So I was out here back in February of 2024, and then again in December of 2024, to try and give you some better understanding of how the electric power system works. Again, to really try and lay a foundation for you to better understand what's on the right-hand side there, the Block Island Energy Roadmap that I'm here to talk about today. So for those of you who have attended those other 2 meetings, what I'm going to go through today is going to be a little bit of a refresher course. I can barely remember what I had for breakfast yesterday, so I think most of you, like me, may be able to benefit from a little bit of a refresher course on some of this material. But I feel like it's pretty important to kind of increase your capacity, your understanding of the power system, because if you're interested in moving to renewable forms of energy on this island to power it, there are some very real challenges that come with that. And you just need to understand what those are, again, so you can make these better informed trade-offs associated with decisions for the future. The last thing here was there was discussion of potentially pursuing a community solar project here on the island. This is one of the types of resources you will see we analyzed. So in preparation for that, I wanted to connect the Block Island Utility District team with another federally funded technical assistance program called the National Community Solar Partnership. One of my colleagues at Berkeley Lab leads this program, and we had a preliminary conversation about a year or so ago, but decided really to table that until after we were able to do this final energy roadmap presentation today. Really create some connections with this other technical assistance opportunity so that if you chose as a community to go down that pathway of pursuing community solar, you could get some expertise from the National Lab Complex to help you down that pathway, because I unfortunately have to step away after this report is filed with you all. But in terms of moving forward and taking action on things that you all want to pursue, this program is one way to sort of give you some technical expertise on how to do that. So that was really what this ETIP project is all about. Okay, so let's do a little bit of Electric Grid 101. So from the electric grid standpoint, first and foremost, you have to produce the electricity. That typically comes from these large central station generation facilities, can come from big solar arrays, wind farms, et cetera. But ultimately, you need to produce this electricity somewhere, some way. Now, let's take yourself off the island. Let's put yourself on the mainland. Where that electricity generated is typically very far away from where energy is demanded, where energy is consumed. And so a lot like a product that has to get shipped to an end customer, there is a superhighway for energy to get moved around the country. That is referred to as the transmission system. Those big poles and wires you see, dotting sort of in the Midwest, you can see it a little bit easier, but those really alien-looking things, that is the transmission system. They can carry large volumes of electricity over great distances with minimal loss of that electricity because of heat. And so the energy gets generated, goes up on this big superhighway, and then gets moved closer to where it's going to be consumed. But much like highways, big trucks have to get off the highway, go to some place, so that good that's being delivered to a household has to go down to surface streets, smaller neighborhoods, and then potentially down to, let's say, dirt roads. Same concept exists in the electric sector. We're moving off of the big transmission system, and then we're moving to lower voltage levels to distribute that energy around. So we're stepping it down, sending it out to, let's say, a county, stepping it down again, sending it to a town, and maybe stepping it down one last time to go to an individual neighborhood or a house. So those are the three key components of an electric grid. The other thing I want you to understand about this electric grid is basically at all times, supply of electricity has to equal the demand for electricity. You're going to hear me say this a lot over the course of this talk today. And you've heard me say it in the prior two talks as well. So hopefully this is not new for those of you who have been here before. The system is designed to ensure that supply equals demand. And it has very tight tolerances for when those get out of balance. Because if they get out of balance, bad things can happen. Infrastructure can get damaged. If infrastructure gets damaged, it has to get replaced at a cost. Oftentimes, to replace something that gets broken on the electric grid can take quite a while, and it can come at big costs. And so the system is actually designed in a way to avoid being damaged. And so it has a very tight tolerance for ensuring that supply equals demand. So this is really critical to understand, that all parts of the system are designed this way, whether it's at the generation system, the transmission system, or all the way down at the distribution system. And it's true here on Block Island. It's true in my neighborhood in upstate New York. So let's now turn to what's unique about Block Island. Well, when the offshore wind facility came on, you all of a sudden got access to the mainland's grid through this undersea cable. And it has two-way flow of electricity. So you are able to pull as much electricity from the mainland as that cable will allow. But on the flip side, the developers of the wind facility said, hey, we want all of the capacity going the other direction, from the island to the mainland, for just the electricity that we are producing. So you, here on Block Island, have no ability to push any electricity from the island back to the mainland. So this is really critical, because if you cannot push electricity down that undersea cable, then anything you produce here on the island must be consumed on the island, because supply has to equal demand. Okay? Yeah.
Shut the system down if it was sent backwards.
It's my understanding too.
But is that something that could be re-engineered? I think it could be, if there was a different type of arrangement. Assuming you're not able to.
So I will admit, I'm not an engineer, I'm an economist. So that's a great question. I definitely think it's one that is better suited for the utility district, whether the engineering aspects of it can be done. My understanding was more of it is a capacity issue of the solar, the wind farm is like, we want all of this pipe for our stuff. So it's not that you can't circumvent it, it's more, we don't want anybody competing with us or crowding our electrons out. Therefore, we're not even going to give you the ability to push any power down. That's my limited understanding of it.
What percentage?
Right.
We're thinking about this after looking at the study, and I know this is getting into weeds, but it's going to be a big question to ask. What is that capacity?
Yeah. And I mean, ultimately, like you said, that is definitely a conversation to be having with, the developers of it. And is it something, if that capacity factor is really low and they're willing to entertain some sort of dynamic ability for you to use it at different times because it's not being utilized? Great, right? I mean, that's certainly something to consider. But I also think from a developer standpoint, it's way easier for them to just say, nope, we want it all the time. Don't worry, we're willing to pay the price of having it be underutilized. But definitely grounds for a conversation for sure. Okay. So when we think about supply always having to meet demand, we need to think about how variable the demand for electricity can be. So this is a graph of every hour of the day in 2040. So we developed a load forecast. I will get to this in a second, but I wanted to really illustrate the point that if you look at the demand for electricity here on Block Island in 2040 for one of our forecasts that we developed, you can see that, it bounces around a decent amount, whether it's, it shows some pattern, cyclical pattern, wintertime, spring, summer, fall. You can see over the course of a day, it varies, but that variation gets a lot bigger in the summertime than it is in, let's say, the spring or potentially the fall. But you can see at the end of the day, and you can also see if you this is the zero line here, this is, zero demand for electricity. You can see that it maxes out at about 7 megawatts and has a low level of about 1,500 megawatts. So when you think about the supply of electricity that you might produce on the island, And the idea that supply has to always equal demand. You got to think about the fact that demand can be as low as 1,500 or as high as 7,000. Now, there are ways to potentially try and manage that variability, but it does require management. And it requires management at pretty much every time scale you can imagine. Second to second, hour to hour, day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year. So all of that variability is squarely on Jeff and the utility district to manage. And so that's just the variability associated with demand. But let's talk about if you want to begin to integrate new resources into the Block Island power grid. So now let's say you want to put a community scale wind facility, or sorry, community scale solar into the grid here. Well, that's going to be producing electricity. That's going to be demanding electricity. And as we said, you can't dump any power up that line. So this can never exceed that. The energy coming out of this can never exceed the demand for electricity here. But this is a solar resource. So what do we know about solar resources? Well, they're variable. I mean, look outside right now. It's cloudy. Earlier today, it was bright and sunny. So this solar resource is going to produce a different amount of electricity at 10 o'clock on a sunny day than it will at 4 o'clock on a somewhat cloudy day. And so not only is it variable, but it's not what's called dispatchable, meaning you can't control the output of that solar array like you can control, let's say, a natural gas generator. The folks who run the bulk power system will send a signal to every single dispatchable generator on its system saying, in 5 minutes, I want you to produce this amount of electricity. 5 minutes later, I want you to move to this level of electricity. So that's what's called dispatching. I can dispatch a unit to tell it exactly how much electricity to produce. Not only can I do that, it also, by moving up or down, I have to worry about how fast it can move up or down. Just like your car, a Porsche can accelerate a heck of a lot different than, let's say, a Ford Fiesta can. Same thing is true of generators on the system. They can only move so fast up or down in these 5-minute intervals. But the solar array, it doesn't ramp at all. It ramps on its own. If all of a sudden a thunderstorm comes through, it is dropping an enormous amount of electricity because all of a sudden it goes from bright sun to very dark. But it's not controllable. And so this is the real inherent challenge with solar that utilities across the country are having to deal with, including here on Block Island. Yeah, of course. So they are a way to deal with it. And I will get to that. Yes, thank you we will get to that issue. But for now, let's just assume there is no cost-effective way to store electricity, because that's typically the way things have worked. Once you do have some ability to store electricity cost-effectively, some of these issues go away, but not all of this variability goes away. So we'll get to that, okay? Just trust me, we'll get to it. What I want to do is sort of lay more a general foundation and then add layers like that to it. How do you mitigate these problems? Okay? Bear with me. So we have uncertainty between what we expect to happen, let's say a day ahead of time, versus what actually happens in real time. So these are just inherent challenges. The system doesn't just work on its own. The system does require planning, and the system requires forward thinking from an operations standpoint. And so the more uncertainty we introduce into the system, just the more challenges there are to make supply and demand balance. Similarly, the more variability there is, ranging from high to low, how quickly do those changes occur over time? That variability also introduces a level of challenge to ensure supply equals demand. These are all things that can be managed, but you have to be thoughtful, diligent, and they come at a cost. That's what I'm really trying to get at. So if we want to integrate this solar into the Block Island system, but we haven't planned for it appropriately, well, then supply gets way out of whack with demand and the whole system goes down. That makes all of you unhappy. So have to be really thoughtful about how you manage all of that variability. And obviously that variability and uncertainty gets exacerbated as more and more of this solar resource comes onto the grid. This is the amount of variability that now needs to be dealt with in 2040 when we think about trying to meet all of the maximum demand for electricity here in Block Island with solar, predominantly solar resources. So this is an enormous amount of variability that we are now introducing that needs to be balanced in some way. Again, it's not that it can't be done. It's just you're moving from that level of variability to now a substantially greater level of variability. And as you can see here, this zero line, so what this graph represents is, sorry, I probably should have started with that. So this blue, as I said, was the electricity demand. What I then do is say, okay, I have to deal, or I should say the utility district, has to deal with the variability associated with all of those uncontrolled resources that may be out on the system. So what we're assuming here is that we've got a bunch of solar resources that are not dispatchable. And so that level of variability, it's technically will reduce the demand for electricity because I don't have to serve that, but I still have to manage the variability associated with it. So this is called net demand, which is literally the demand for electricity minus any supply that is on the island, because the net of those two is what we are going to have to manage to ensure supply equals demand. So it's just a mathematical way of representing that variability. And so what you see here is substantially more variability than there was if we just had to worry about the demand for electricity. But in addition, we see a zero line means we have, if we're above that line, it means there is a demand for electricity in excess of the supply in Block Island. If we're below that zero line, it means there is more energy being produced on the island than is demanded. So we have extra energy, but we can't push that back down the cable to the mainland like you might want. It has to stay here. So anything below that zero line, we have to figure out what to do with. Yes?
I just want to make sure I understand.
Sure.
It's pretty important. So if we remove the orange yellow line, we would just have blue going down from 0 to approximately 7 megawatts. All right, so then you add in the solar resource, and it looks like it peaks out at in 2040 at almost 5 megawatts. Is that, am I looking at that correctly?
So the blue represents the demand for electricity every hour of the year, graphed out. I then subtract off of that all of the generation on island that's being produced by a variety of different resources. Again, I will tell you in a little bit of slides what exactly that looks like. But the purpose of this is to illustrate that's a lot of variability to deal with on the island. This is an awful lot more variability to deal with on the island. I'm happy to go over the numbers with you, but I think for this purposes, let's move on. Okay, so a lot more variability that needs to be dealt with. Okay, so those are the basics, a lot, but those are the basics. So now let's talk about what this means for you all in 2040. Okay, so what we heard from conversations with the utility district team as well as conversations with you all early on was an interest in promoting solar and not wind on the island from a renewable resource standpoint. So we exclusively looked at rooftop solar and community solar when it came to renewable resources. We also understood that about a year ago, there was a lot of talk about a biofuel generator being put in at the transfer station. Not knowing whether for sure that was going to go ahead, but it sounded relatively certain, the team decided, to ultimately just include that in this analysis. So these are the two, or I should say the three sources of supply on the island that we looked out to 2040 and said, how much of these resources do we think are reasonable to assume could exist on the island based on objectives that we wanted to meet? So those are our supply resources there. And then on the demand side, we said, well, the demand for electricity is going to also potentially change and could be impacted by decisions here at a community level. We know things like electric vehicles are coming. There's certainly big state goals associated with that, but you all might also promote or not promote the adoption of electric vehicles depending on a lot of different things. And then the other thing that we assumed could affect demand for electricity here in Block Island are things like introduction of air source heat pumps, electric water heaters, transitioning typically things that were not electrically driven to things in the future that will be electrically driven because they're simply more efficient, but also because of a lot of other reasons, decarbonization being potentially one of them. There's also big state goals associated with transitioning towards air source heat pumps and electric water heaters. And last but not least, various types of energy efficiency improvements just in building structures, building envelope improvements, to just sort of name one in particular. So this 2040 vision includes things on the supply side, but also things on the demand side. That's what we ultimately heard from all of you and the utility district team that we needed to model. Yes. Yeah, Carlos.
Solar, basically shorthand for non-utility residential and commercial.
That's correct.
So that includes ground mounted systems.
We only looked at rooftop solar for the analysis. We did not. So community solar, strictly ground mounted. Rooftop solar, strictly rooftop. I'll talk a little bit more. I'll talk in several slides. I'll talk about sort of the methodology we use to assume what the availability was of those resources. But those are the two technologies that we looked at. Okay, so let me give you a sneak peek of what the results of this are, and then I'll go through this analysis and give you all the details associated with it. But the key takeaways at the end of the day were sustainability. We can, through a portfolio of on-island and off-island resources, ensure that 100% of the electricity that is consumed on Block Island comes from renewable forms of energy. So, from a sustainability standpoint, your goals can be met. We heard a lot about self-reliance. The assumption we're making in 2040 is that there is enough on-island resources to meet the maximum demand for electricity. That is not saying all of those resources provide all of the energy you need on the island. Instead, it says in that 1 hour where you hit the maximum demand, we have enough resources for you to be self-sufficient in that hour. Now, there are certainly other hours in which you are going to be self-sufficient as well, but it only ends up being about 30% of the hours. And I'll get to why that's the case, because that may seem a little bit odd. In addition, by hitting that one maximum, that 1 hour with all of your energy being on island, when we look at the entire year, those on-island resources are only able to supply up to 45% of your annual energy needs. So this is really important to understand that you can be self-reliant in that 1 hour, in fact, 30% of the hours. But there are an awful lot of other hours of the year where you're needing to bring power in because the sun isn't shining, as just one example. Yes, yep, it was. So we ultimately sized the battery storage to avoid all curtailment. That was the extent of the batteries that we ultimately ended up putting in. And even with that, you still see a lot of energy needing to get brought on the island through the undersea cable. From an affordability standpoint, obviously a big concern for all of you because your costs are typically more expensive for just about everything by living on an island. In this case, what we ultimately found based on this analysis is that the costs to achieve this future are roughly comparable, in fact, a little bit lower than your current supply costs. So from an affordability standpoint, again, based on the assumptions and the data we had available, this is definitely an affordable future for all of you, no more expensive than what it is today. In fact, it appears to be somewhat less expensive. And the variability associated with those costs are relatively modest. So there's not a big risk that it could be super high or super low, at least based on the assumptions and the analysis that we performed. Like I talked about, we analyzed a bunch of different scenarios that traded off rooftop versus community solar. Again, rooftop solar being just the panels on top of everyone's roofs, community solar being ground-mounted solar. And so when we compare those two over the course of the analysis, what we've certainly found is that community solar is far more controllable in the sense that the utility can issue an RFP for a specific location on the island to develop community solar. Makes it a lot more controllable. Rooftop solar, they don't really have that kind of an ability to drive adoption. I think as I've heard over the last 2 years, you've seen this past year, there's been a lot of adoption of rooftop solar. The 12-month period prior to that, not nearly as much. My understanding that's largely driven to some benefactors on the island that have provided some incentives, financial incentives, that have really driven the more recent adoption of it. But from a controllable standpoint, or setting goals and achieving those goals for adoption levels, community solar is just far easier to achieve because you can direct how you're going to achieve it. Versus rooftop solar, you have to really be dependent on people of their own volition because the economics make sense, choose to do it. Now, you can change the economic incentives to try and drive adoption. But my understanding is you also have other challenges when it comes to contractors, access to the solar panels and things like that, that sometimes make it more challenging for you all to install solar than, say, maybe me in upstate New York. So these are all things that just need to be considered when trying to trade off what you think the future looks like between community versus rooftop. Yeah.
Very cost competitive, mainly because of way of logistical factors. So
Okay.
it wouldn't be a case that there was a state program.
Okay. I was under the impression there's oftentimes a labor challenge of getting labor force out here. I said that's certainly the case with energy efficiency. I understand your energy efficiency programs are pretty underutilized relative to, let's say, mainland for similar levels of incentives. And that's often because of just, getting contractors out here to do it.
But I would say if you're a program, then you would absolutely have it. I always had it.
Okay, so again, I think this speaks to if there are current challenges where the adoption level of these things is not meeting current expectations. Again, to get to this level of adoption you're talking about, you need to be deliberate about it. And that's really my point, is where are you today versus where do you want to go? What are the things that may be limiting the adoption of certain technologies today? Are those things going to inherently change on their own, or do you need to be more deliberate about changing those factors to achieve that future? But what's uniquely different about rooftop and community scale solar is typically undertaken based on a long-term contract that is entered into between the utility district and the solar developer. And that contract, if you're a developer, you want certainty. If the utility decides, I don't need your power today because supply doesn't equal demand. Well, the developer says, well, okay, I am now losing revenue because you're not going to pay me for that. I'm not really happy about that because I don't know what that risk looks like. And so across the country, not unique to Block Island, not unique to Rhode Island, but across the country, these kinds of community solar programs, community solar contracts, typically have what's called a take or pay contract, which says, I will sell you this amount of electricity over the course of the year. You will buy it from me whether you actually consume it or not. If you need to shut this off because you can't manage it on your system, that's your problem. I've produced it, you still have to pay me for it. Now that stands in sharp contrast to the existing rooftop solar program policy that the utility district runs. The utility district has the ability to shut off rooftop solar that it would not have and not compensate rooftop solar, which is different than community solar. So there are these business model differences between the two of them that are important to understand. And we'll get into what the financial implications of those are. Last but not least, this gets back to the point I was just making about labor forces and sort of challenges of, we developed a status quo forecast into the future based on basically our current understanding of adoptions of energy efficiency technologies, electric vehicles, air source heat pumps, et cetera. So extrapolated those out to the future. Those are all relatively low and modest adoption levels currently, but there are very aggressive goals that have been set at a state level and potentially at a federal or broader regional level when it comes to those types of technologies. And so we also wanted to provide an upper end estimate of what it could look like if those goals were achieved. Now we understand you're probably going to be somewhere in between those two, but this gives you a sense of an envelope. Where do you fit? What's the lowest it could be? What's the highest it could be? And then you're going to be somewhere in between. So, but the issue associated with achieving these established goals goes back to the point of, why are the adoption levels of these technologies right now relatively low? And are those drivers of adoption going to fundamentally change in the future? For example, electric vehicles right now are not all that cost competitive with internal combustion engines, cars. But will costs come down enough that they become more cost competitive? Will they just become ubiquitous because certain auto manufacturers will just stop producing internal combustion engines, in which case all you can get is an electric vehicle? Those are things outside of your control that may dictate whether you achieve, whether these established goals are achieved or not. But there are also things that you as a utility district and as a community can choose to do deliberately to achieve those established goals. And that again is really my point in bringing up these two alternative futures to say, what do you want to be deliberate about trying to achieve down the road? Okay, so let's delve into each of the different component pieces of the analysis that we performed. Yes, Carlos.
Right, the status quo and established. Yeah, what is the status quo?
I will get into that in a second. So what we did in terms of developing a forecast for the demand for electricity on an hourly basis in 2040 was we started with a baseline electricity forecast. And by that, what I mean is we took the existing 2024 hourly energy profile for here on the island, and we took basically what the utility district does in terms of just extrapolating that forward. It uses a very simple compound annual growth rate, assumes load grows at about 1.5% or 2% a year. We did the exact same thing, which really embeds a lot of things into it. It doesn't address any of these more deliberate actions that you all on Block Island could undertake. So we wanted to explicitly reflect, what if there is a more deliberate effort to promote building electrification, air source heat pumps adoption, and hot water heating, electric hot water heaters. And that's going to add to the demand forecast. Energy efficiency is going to do the opposite. If you tighten the building envelope up, it's going to make it more energy efficient, and therefore you will consume less electricity as a community. Full home electrification is largely just a fancy way of saying we do a bunch of energy efficiency and electrification all as one as a big package. So if you haven't done either of these two things, you can do it as a big package. And we reflected the fact that some folks have already done that, but maybe haven't done that in the future, or vice versa. If you haven't done either of them, then you can do that one. That was really what these independent measures were intended to reflect when we built up this forecast, versus an integrated solution if you hadn't done either of them. And then last but not least is the idea of electric vehicle adoption, and the fact that charging all of that those electric vehicles is going to substantially or potentially substantially increase the demand for electricity in the future.
At warnings that you really need to check the utility to make sure that full distribution system, I think, can handle that.
Yep.
Different, but you can regulate the charging periods for these, so it wouldn't be a coincident demand, right? You could distribute that.
To your point, back to the point I keep making, you need to be deliberate about that. So I actually just got off a panel at the Northeast Regional Public Utility Commission symposium this morning on exactly that topic of EV rate design. And so you can use rate design to promote more managed charging, so you avoid, exacerbating this concept of supply and demand not balancing. But you need to be deliberate about it. You need to develop those rates. You need to create the control infrastructure, et cetera. It's the deliberateness that's the point, I think, is really I'm trying to make. So in terms of the assumptions that we made, to your question, Carlos, so on the status quo, this is a lower bound estimate. We literally looked at the experience here on Block Island of the adoption of beneficial electrification measures, energy efficiency measures, and full home electrification. They run an energy efficiency program. We looked at the experience of that to inform what we felt like was, if that just continues on into the future, that's what the status quo would look like. When it comes to EV adoption, we did not find readily accessible information about EV adoption here on Block Island. We used the next closest county information on the mainland as a proxy for what was going on here on Block Island. And that was based on the EIA information that was available. And then when we talk about established goals, these were goals that were in line with the 2050 Rhode Island decarbonization targets for a variety of energy efficiency improvements or beneficial electrification, way more aggressive than what you all have experienced here in Block Island, for sure. Similarly, on the EV side, we looked at some national analysis to try and inform what we thought really aggressive EV adoption goals looked like. And that comes out of this NREL electrification future study, and in particular, the high electrification scenario. And so you can see on the right-hand side what the different levels of adoption are. Under established goal is status quo is the light blue bars. The whatever darker blue bar is the established goals, and you can see just how dramatic the differences are between status quo and established goals. Now let's talk about what the electrical implications are of all of the adoption of those different measures. And what we see is in 2026, you've got a peak demand on the island, or peak demand for electricity of about 6 megawatts. By the time we get out to 2040, in our status quo case, that summer peak demand has risen to about 7.5 megawatts. But when we look at established goals, that's gone all the way up to about 10 megawatts. So we've more than doubled the demand for electricity in 2040 by meeting these aggressive goals. But what's, I think, more importantly, and I think shocked Jeff, was the fact that you went from being a summer peaking utility, which you are right now, to being a winter peaking utility. And this is all because of the electric water heaters, the adoption of electric air source heat pumps to swap out for all of the propane, gas, wood, whatever else, oil, whatever else, you're using for heating. So, and it's not just that it's a winter peaking utility. Your maximum demand for electricity is now almost 13 megawatts, right? It's about 6 here. So you've more than doubled that level of demand that has to be met on island.
Where's the sad thing that houses occupy much more than they are currently? That's not, that's what it's done.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to review that part of the assumptions with you. We did not look explicitly at utilization. So there may be an overestimation if we presumed, I don't remember what we presumed in terms of the utilization of those different technologies and the impact from an electrical standpoint. To your point, if we assumed all of the accounts, like, where was it? I think it was on the prior slide, right? This one, eligible customers. So if all these eligible customers get air source heat pumps, but over the wintertime, only 25% of them are actually, available or really to be used. Yeah, I think that's a great question. I actually hadn't thought about that. So that may overstate that demand for electricity a little bit in the winter. It's a good point.
Adoption of more technologies. The summer peak is going to be increasing more because now there's a air conditioning load because of that push. And that would probably outweigh water pushing more.
What I think, though, the difference is a lot. Again, you all know better than I do, but right now my understanding is most people have or have historically recently had window units. And so you're replacing highly inefficient window units with incredibly efficient air source heat pumps. What's that? Okay, so that's the issue, is whether you're replacing something that's really inefficient with something that's substantially more efficient, or you're assuming that it's just new load that didn't exist before.
Hey, Pete.
Yeah.
I just to put those numbers into context, can you go back to your other slide?
Yeah, sure.
Just to put this into context, our substation right now is rated for 6 megawatts. All right, that's a national grid feed to us, 6 megawatts. So this slide here got my attention, and at first I pushed back on Pete. I'm like, that's impossible. But it's not impossible, and that's exactly what every utility across America is facing right now. Our substation is rated for 6. We almost hit that last summer. So what National Grid, Rhode Island Energy does, they turn the fans on, it produces cooling for the transformer, and then we can get 7.5 out. So we're good to 7.5. After 7.5, we're looking at probably a $2 or $3 million upgrade that we're going to be on the hook for. When you get out to 2040, if we were to ever get to the 12, 13, 14 level, you're looking at another voltage conversion, because there's no way we're ever going to serve that kind of load with even the voltage that we're converting to now. The voltage conversion that we're doing now is pretty affordable because we're using all the same transformers. We just rewire them. If we ever had to convert our voltage to 12 kV, 15 kV, every transformer in the system has to be replaced. So this slide right here for me, I think was the eye opener. And again, at first I pushed back, but now I'm more worried about it than ever because we're already hitting the 6 almost. And just to point on the air conditioning too, the real air conditioning load, I think, that comes here, I know, it comes on boats. It comes on boats that dock at Payne's Dock and the basin, the boat basin and Champlin's, if they were ever to connect to us during the summertime. So those boats, they get bigger and bigger, more air conditioning. So it's that transient population that comes out during the summertime, I think, that I worry about more than our own folks.
Okay.
But this is an eye-opening slide, and it comes with, great increased sales for us. We can help lower our rates down.
Right.
But it's also going to take some pretty significant capital upgrades in order to even keep the lights on.
And to be very clear, we did not, and based on the conversations with the utility district folks, we did not take those upgrades into account in the analysis here. Okay. So that's on the demand side, what things look like. Now let's talk about the supply side. So as I mentioned, There's a relatively small biofuel generator that was under discussion at the transfer station. We assumed that would go in. We have existing rooftop solar under the legacy, the old net energy metering, all of those rooftop solar systems. We assume we're still going to be around in 2040. Maybe not the best assumption, but that was the one we made just to assume that was all still there. New solar, rooftop solar under what we're calling a buy-all, sell-all. That's sort of more industry jargon. It's qualifying facility, I think is what you all call it here. They are exactly the same thing if it all gets exported to the grid, and whatever gets exported gets compensated at an avoided cost rate. So we took into account the existing rooftop solar under the buy-all, sell-all that has currently been installed since the net energy metering program closed. But we assumed all new rooftop solar would go in under that program as well. On the community solar side, again, this is ground-mounted solar. It's all going to, produce electricity, but at a much larger scale. And then if whatever other things are needed to ensure supply equals demand, we're going to go out to the market. You're going to have to go buy it from somebody off island. Now, every utility in the country largely tries to meet 90, 95, 98% of their energy with forward contracts. Those forward contracts can be many, many years into the future for small chunks of load, or they could be short duration contracts for large chunks of load. Utilities typically across the country want certainty when it comes to the economics. They don't want to, there's a lot of reasons for that we can get into some other time, but they typically want certainty. And so what utilities typically do is pre-contract a year, 2, 3 more ahead for the vast majority of their electricity. But they also recognize, hey, this could be a low energy year, could be cooler than normal, right? For whatever reason, the economy could be down, and so energy consumption could be down. So if you overbuy, well, now what do you do with all that extra energy? So typically what utilities do is they reserve a little bit at the end and say, we're just going to buy this in the open market. And so that's what these spot market purchases represent. So what we did, let's see. So we assume all of those are on the table let me go back to the slide actually. We assume all of these are on the table. What, from an analytical standpoint, we're ultimately going to do is say, let's try and serve as much on the island as possible, and then all the rest to make sure supply equals demand, we're going to go off island. And I'll talk a little bit more about how exactly we do that under these different conditions in a second. But let's talk about what is available on the island when it comes to these different types of resources. So we did a GIS analysis. We looked at every single parcel of land on Block Island in order to try and determine the amount of land in each one of those parcels where you could possibly put a ground-mounted solar system. But in order to do that, you have to take into account all sorts of exclusions that disallow parts of these parcels from having a ground-mounted solar system built on it. So things like land use restrictions. It's forever wild. You're not putting ground-mounted solar on a forever wild piece of land. Conservation land, wetlands, buffers. You can't build there, so we need to take that into account. We've got social things. Hey, if you've got a right-of-way, you certainly can't put a ground-mounted solar system on a right-of-way. And then finally, there are technical requirements. We're not going to assume you can put a ground-mounted solar where there's a building. So we tried to take all of these different factors into account using a GIS system to ultimately identify where could we possibly put ground-mounted community-scale solar resources here on Block Island. And so what we found is this graphic on the left. The green parts represent, I know it's very small. Well, I'll have a much bigger version of this zoomed in, or a high resolution image that you can all use to look at after when we're done with the project. But the point is, you can see there's an awful lot of green that still exists. In fact, there's about 720 acres of viable land here on Block Island after taking all of those exclusions into account. That equates to about 140 megawatts of power that could be produced exclusively by community scale solar. Now, 140 megawatts on the whole island. 140, it's an instantaneous measure of capacity. So the corollary to this would be peak demand. So right now you have about a 6 megawatt peak demand. We're talking in 2040, that ranging from anywhere from 8 to 12 megawatts. So 140 megawatts is orders of magnitude more solar capacity than you need to meet maximum demand here on the island. And there's a conversion we have for acres per megawatt of solar capacity we use to get to that number. And so you have more than enough land to meet 100% of the demand for electricity in 2040, which means you get to choose and be pretty discerning about where you want to develop community solar systems. Next, when we looked at rooftop solar, we did a slightly less robust analysis. We had only a set budget to work with here, a lot of stuff to do, and so this is one of the areas where we did not do nearly as robust an analysis as, let's say, in that GIS or the demand forecast analysis that we did. Here, I went out to a software package that looks at, that allows you to zoom in on any property here on Block Island, look at the structure on it, and literally draw a nice little polygon and say, what's the size of that polygon? That polygon now represents the size, the maximum size of rooftop solar system that could go on that roof. So I did this for a sample of about 25, 30 different properties here on the island. I tried to use a variety of different sizes of buildings to sort of look at, and then fed that into a piece of software that the National Renewable Energy Laboratory developed called PV Watts. And so when we do that, I found that basically the average solar system is about 5.1 kilowatts. That's bigger than the average size system under your existing net energy metering program that closed a few years ago. It's even bigger than the most recent set of systems that have come online through this qualifying facility tariff. So again, this may be aggressive in terms of the maximum amount of capacity that folks would be willing to invest in and put on their rooftops. But if you assume that is the number, then there's about 1,850 rooftops that supposedly can accommodate about 5.5 kilowatts. And that produces a total amount of capacity of around 9.5 megawatts of energy, of demand for electricity. So again, if we're assuming the status quo forecast has a peak demand of about 7.78 megawatts, this will fully cover that demand for electricity. In the established goals case, it's higher, 10.4 megawatts in the summer. So it doesn't quite get you everything, but it gets you 93% of the way there. Yeah, Dave.
Was there a specific solar technology that you took on? Was it multi-mode or battery storage, or it's just grid tied string, or just a
generic? Yeah, there's no this is definitely not a battery system connected to this. This is just generic PV Watts, default values, not trying to seem like that was the most, to me, that was the most reasonable one to take because it said, not everyone's gonna, a lot of people are gonna take the vanilla flavor. Yep. So a lot of community solar is available to you, which means you could be discerning about where to put it. And there's also not as much, but a fair amount of rooftop solar available to you to meet the demands for electricity. So between those two resources, you have a lot of on-island energy to meet your maximum demand for electricity. And so when we do our analysis in that summer peak hour where we hit the maximum demand for electricity, because supply has to equal demand, when we do the analysis here, we have to build up where is all the energy coming from to meet the demand for electricity in that hour. And so we assumed if the biofuel generator was on, it's always, it's always running at this one level, 18 hours a day is effectively what we assumed based on the information that we got associated with that generator. Then we have community scale solar output, net energy metering, rooftop solar, and the qualifying facility BASA solar. And so in this 1 hour, you are not reliant on anything off island. You are purely self-reliant. There is no spot market purchases, and you're basically not bringing anything across the cable. So in this hour, you are totally self-sufficient. But let's talk about managing variability. So that's great. In that 1 hour, we're able to perfectly make things balance. But let's talk about variability a little bit more of a granular scale than that annual graphic I showed you earlier. So this is August 7th versus May 11th, and you're going to see a couple obvious differences here, right? August demand for electricity, much above where it is in early spring. You can also see a difference in the shape of the demand for electricity, right? This moves up pretty substantially by the middle part of the day, stays level until towards the evening hours, and then comes back down. Whereas in May, it's kind of flat. It moves a little bit, but not a ton. Yeah. Hours of the day. Yep, exactly. So 24 hours of the day. So the demand for electricity is variable over time and obviously varies from, month to month, season to season. But what about on-island production? So if we take all of those on-island resources and we make some assumptions about how much community solar versus how much rooftop solar, what we see is two not so different production profiles between May and August. So this day in August is interesting and reflects the fact that, look, you probably had clear weather all the way through the day in May, but in August, we have some clouds that come in about 8 o'clock in the morning. So all of a sudden that solar production sort of levels off for 2 hours, and then the clouds go away or a storm moves through, and then we ramp up very quickly to where we would expect if it was a perfectly clear day, and then it drops back down over time. So a couple of important additional things to note here, right? This is solar energy. There is nothing being produced before 5 o'clock in the morning or 6 o'clock at night. So if supply has to always equal demand, what do we do in all of these different periods where supply is up here, demand is down here? Supply is all the way down here, but demand is up there. We have to find a way to balance these things. And so the first option, we will get to batteries in a second, but the first option, we'll get to that in a second. So what this means is you have to import an awful lot of electricity in the periods when solar energy is not being produced. Now, if you wanted to consider other renewable forms of resources, like wind actually is a pretty good overnight resource. But as a community, you've chosen, at least up to this point, to not want to consider it. But this illustrates the challenge of pushing all of your eggs from a renewable standpoint into a solar basket. It means in these non-sun, when the sun isn't shining, you have to go off island to get electricity. Second thing, so what that means from an analytical standpoint is you are importing the majority of your power over the course of 2040. And that's true on an annual basis, where the imports are in excess of 60%, 70%, about 80%, depending on which demand forecast we're talking about. And even if we talk about in the daytime, forget about the overnight hours, even if we focus on the daytime, sunshine is pretty variable over the course of the year. And so even in the daytime, at best, you're meeting 50% of the demand for electricity with on-island resources. So again, based on the mix of resources that are being talked about, you're still importing an awful lot of energy. Yeah, sure thing, Carlos. Say that one again.
paragraphs are the entire year?
It's for the, so this top one is for the entire year. This bottom one is just for daylight hours during the entire year. Yep, exactly. Yep. Correct. The bar represents, actually, no, this does represent the share of total kilowatt hours in all hours of the year, or the share of kilowatt hours during just daylight hours of the year. Yep. Yeah, sorry, that wasn't more obvious. So now we have to start thinking about, well, what do we do in those instances where we have too much electricity being produced relative to the demand for electricity? Supply has to always equal demand. So what do we do in this period here where we're over generating? We have too much supply. Well, first thing we can do is basically what we do with the existing buy all, sell all, or qualifying facility tariff. We just turn those systems off. So that's one way to handle this. And so that's one of the things we can do to avoid having to have this excess energy. Now, that's not a big problem when the demand for electricity is relatively high. But on the days when the demand for electricity is really low, that level of curtailment, it's called, or wasted energy is really can be quite large. So when we looked at the entirety of the year, what we found is that roughly 19 to 23% of that on-island energy has to be curtailed to maintain supply and demand. With no storage, exactly. With no storage. That is a key point. So we're having to waste an awful lot of energy here. Now, whose energy are we wasting? That's the next question. Well, we made an assumption that first and foremost, the utility is going to curtail those rooftop solar customers under the buy all, sell all tariff because it's free. The way your buy all, sell all, your qualifying facility tariff is written, the utility has the ability to curtail those customers without having to compensate them for the energy that's being wasted. In contrast, the community solar contract requires the utility, or we assumed would require the utility, to pay the solar developer for that wasted energy. So we're only going to curtail community solar if we've gone through all of the free to the utility rooftop solar. Does this make sense? This is really an economic decision based on the part of the utility. But it's important to remember, these guys have a solar system to pay off just like those guys do. And so by not paying them for curtailing electricity, they still have to make payments on those solar systems. And the energy that they were producing is now being wasted. So this is what's called an opportunity cost, meaning they would have had the opportunity to sell that energy, but because of the way in which you've decided to contract with them, it allows that energy to be wasted and not compensated. So again, these are choices you could make. You could make a different choice as a community that maybe you want to compensate them for that wasted solar. But for our analytical purposes, we maintained that program, and therefore they are the first ones in line to be curtailed. And if we still need more curtailment of supply to meet demand, then we go after the community scale solar, but we have to pay for it. Yeah, Dave, you look like you got a question.
This is assuming that solar is 100% of your power provision.
Well, this assumes all of these things, and so we assumed that this was still cheaper than that to do. So it was an economic ration. It was an economic argument to do so.
Instead of indigenous.
Well, again, you could ultimately get to probably a more from an analytical standpoint, you could definitely get to a point of saying, well, what if we are curtailing it on the peak day, then we're avoiding our peak demand, which goes towards our ICAP obligation, which goes towards our transmission costs. Yes, I mean, there are more robust analytical methods one could take to decide what to cut. We took a more simplified approach, again, for just analytical purposes to illustrate the trade-offs that need to be made. Yeah.
I can't help myself. So
That's okay.
So one other important thing to talk about, and Chris, you hit the nail right on the head. So I'm really proud of what the utility district's done in terms of power supply. So our power supply subcommittees here at the table, me, it's John, Barbara, myself, we've got some experts who help us with that. Price certainty is something that we really value. Okay, you guys had too many years of diesel fuel up and down, up and down. The one thing that we put as our number one goal is just price certainty. So the items up there that are price certain is the net metering solar on the bottom, the biofuel, the PPA is price certain. I know what that price is every megawatt that I buy. Community solar, I'll know. Community solar curtailments, I'll know. All the other stuff. Spot market, we're never going to have that spot market the same level as the PPA. We try to minimize spot market as much as we can. And the reason is the spot market can go from a negative number. There's times when you can be paid to shut power off generation. And there's times when it goes up to $4,000 or $5,000 a megawatt hour. You know, we pay 60 today. So we try to limit the amount of spot market purchases that we do make. But the important thing is the more we do and the more we look at this, it just becomes more complicated. And the one thing that you can set yourself up for is all of a sudden, you know, a Texas situation where markets start to collapse. You've got rolling blackouts. You've got things that put co-ops like us out of business. There was, I think, 3 co-ops in Texas that actually went bankrupt. And one was a G&T that served, I don't know, 20 some odd different co-ops. So the one thing that we keep in mind through all of our discussions with this is that price certainty, the risk factor. And I just wanted to point out that the spot market, Chris, you're absolutely right. That's never going to be that big. We try to limit that just as much as we can because you never know what's going to happen with a spot price.
And your PPA is not take or pay. You don't take or pay on PPA.
Oh, yeah,
Some of them are, some of them aren't. Yeah.
I have one question.
Yeah.
Has this ever been shut down? Has ever a meter been turned off because of too much going into the grid?
Let me answer that. And you already know the answer, but so not yet, but we're awful close. And the scenarios that Pete's talking about, it's very important to understand that's cable in place, everything closed, everything normal. When the ISO is behind you, helping to manage that supply demand factor, it's a heck of a lot easier. As soon as we disconnect from the cable, whether it be a storm, whether it be a, you know, some sort of an outage, all of a sudden, all this changes because the consequences are much dire. And at that point, you would start getting in curtailment. I think we're going to develop a policy this fall, but I have a feeling by the end of the year, we're going to get in a situation where we're going to have to start curtailing the solar when we're on generators because of the variability. And also during late load periods, April, May, when we just all of a sudden have too much solar. We're getting awful close now. Does that answer your question?
Okay. So from a cost standpoint, we modeled 3 different levels of rooftop solar penetration. 90% of the peak demand was going to be met with rooftop solar, 50% of the peak demand would be met with rooftop solar, and 30% would be met with rooftop solar. On the flip side then, it's community solar that is taking up the difference between those. So that's the trade-off we're trying to show here. And so when we have 90% of rooftop solar meeting peak demand in the summer, there is basically, you know, all we're doing is curtailing the rooftop solar. We don't have to ever touch community solar. But as that share of community solar gets bigger and bigger, you can see that we are beginning to curtail an awful lot of it, especially as we get all the way down to here. And this represents the cost of that. So these are real costs. These are real costs the utility is incurring because it has to pay the community solar developer in that take or pay contract. These represent what I would call indirect costs or opportunity costs. They're not actual money that is being still transacted, but if you bought and installed one of those rooftop solar systems, you're going to be kind of annoyed that you're not getting paid for energy that you are producing because the utility decided it can't handle it, it can't manage it. Whereas the community solar developer is getting paid for that, even though you're in exactly the same situation. Yeah.
Is that the only model for community solar? So in other words, I could envision a world where my wife and I, we have a house that does not lend itself well to solar because of the big tree that we have blocking solar. And I don't think we're the only ones so situated. We would actually be willing to participate in a community solar project that might be much more willing if it were, members of the community to allow these sort of interruptions.
So I think at the end of the day, it's all contracts and lawyers, right? So from that standpoint, sure. I mean, for sure. But what the developer is doing is they're putting their money at stake. So if you as community members were willing to put your money at stake behind this, you could certainly negotiate something like that with, the utility district along those lines.
I'm just wondering if there's another structure that you've heard of that holds.
I can help with that. So it's called group net metering. And what you can do is, so for example, if you have a property that doesn't get sun, your neighbor wants to do it with you, they don't have sun, but you have somebody that does, the three homes can go together and do group net metering, put it on the sunny home, and then share in the benefits of that. In that case, it would be underneath our buy all, sell all program. You're still going to be curtailed right along with everybody else, but you won't be under the same, business structure as a community center.
And it would probably be a smaller
Smaller,
size, system than your typical kind of community scale one.
Yeah.
Yeah, Carlos, I think you were.
Another option too is community solar. It's just its own micro. It doesn't even.
Sure. Oh, yeah. No, you're very true of this is all just independently placed around the island without, so they're treated as independent resources. For sure, if you decide you want to create a microgrid, you want to put the community scale resource within the confines of a microgrid so it could be self-sufficient, yes. We definitely did not model anything in that regard, but to your point, these are all the great types of discussions that I hope this generates is what do we do? Because we don't want to waste all of this solar energy that we're producing. So how can we avoid doing that? We'll get to batteries in a second because that is definitely an option, but there are also contractual opportunities to deal with things. There's electrical ways in which you can also do it in terms of connecting small grids together called microgrids. Yeah, Dave.
Contractor RFP puts in a field and it's one inverter interconnection. Because then I can see that it would make more sense for this type of situation to do multiple inverters and instead of taking the whole system offline.
Right, take a panel or chunks.
Right? I didn't know.
That I will admit is also a more refined analysis than we did here. This was largely like we assumed you could pretty much perfectly curtail the exact amount that you needed. So it gets to your concept of lots of different inverters to try and do this instead of in a gross fashion of like that entire 5.1 kW system now has to come offline. Yep. Okay. So as an alternative, here we get to the batteries, is we can take all that excess power and we can dump it into a lithium ion battery as one example. And then when we get to a point where demand exceeds the supply of electricity on the island, we can then push that power back out and then avoid making, PPA or spot market purchases. So this is the benefits of batteries, is you get to now store that energy for a later point in time where you avoid buying, bringing more energy across the grid, across the undersea cable. Now, the only downside is this is not a frictionless transaction. You lose about, I think it's 30% round trip efficiency, 25, 30% of the energy you are losing from what you put in versus what you pull out. That's based on today's technology, exactly. So in 2040, this is another reason we modeled what we modeled, is because I wanted to provide to you all stable technologies that were proven, and from a cost perspective, we could say, yeah, this is a reasonable cost to assume in 2040. As opposed to 8, 10, 12-hour batteries using molten salt or other types of technologies that are really not proven, but they exist. And the National Renewable Energy Laboratory does have what's called its annual technology baseline. And it does have technical specifications for those different types of technologies, as well as cost assumptions. But as far as I'm concerned, they're just kind of wild estimates at this point. So we tried to keep, this analysis grounded in reasonable technologies that were well-versed and vetted. So these are 4-hour batteries, I think lithium ion 4-hour batteries. So if we now put batteries in to completely avoid curtailment, this is what things look like. Instead of getting rid of any of that energy, anytime supply exceeds the demand for electricity, we're going to be charging the battery. So that's one set of scenarios, and we can compare them against, if it ever decides, there we go. So we can compare them against a case in which we are actually curtailing that energy that would have gone in the battery. So we compare them on an apples to apples basis. Conversely, if we have a case where the supply of electricity actually is below the demand for electricity, well, here we can now begin to discharge that battery. Whereas before, what we needed to do was increase the level of spot market and PPA purchases. We're going to bring more energy in from the mainland, like I said. Yeah, Carlos.
Odd-numbered scenarios versus.
Oh, sorry. Those are just, this is a bit of a legacy from, I think, the presentation I gave you where I numbered these. Yeah, you don't need to worry about that. Sorry. Yeah. Simply a way to try and separate these out from like a numbering or a typology standpoint. Yeah.
All the, your graphs on your page, 45, page 40, the sort of that yellow mountain under the sea kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. This one?
Yes.
Yeah.
So they're peaking at 5.5, not even quite reaching 6, the generation.
Yeah, so this is just, I just chose August 7th, from the data for illustrative reasons.
Is with your page 31 or your page 33 when you're talking about the possibility of producing 140 megawatts.
Yep.
Or 9.5 megawatts.
Right. So the 140 megawatts says if we were to just take every single viable piece of land on Block Island and plant a community scale resource on it, we'd have 140 megawatts. Instead, what we said was, let's take a subset of that and only put enough resources in to meet the maximum demand for electricity. So that is much more than the current amount of solar you have on the island, correct?
Yeah, because I did a little calculation with looking at those proportions to get to 12 megawatts, including the 80% conversion from DC to AC. We're talking about 61 acres will be converted to community.
By my analysis, I think it was closer. We have between 4 and 28 acres, so let's compare notes. Yeah, so for our analysis, we have about, I think there's between 4 to 28 acres of land for community scale solar and between 430 and about 1,800 rooftop systems. Again, depending on which, demand forecast and the level of penetration for the rooftop solar systems. But yeah, let's talk about that afterwards. Okay, so went through these, we did that. Okay, so even with enough batteries to avoid curtailment, we are definitely seeing fewer imports, batteries versus curtailment. Less imports when we have those batteries, because we're charging those batteries up and then we're discharging it instead of buying electricity or bringing electricity in from the mainland. So this is good. This is what those batteries are really expected to do. But even with this penetration of batteries, you're still seeing imports being the majority in all scenarios. You're still importing more electricity than you're producing on island over the course of the year, and even when we talk about in daylight hours. So again, this resource is variable. Yes, it's great, and because it does provide almost 30% of the hours over the course of the year, you are completely self-sufficient. In the case of the established goals, the higher level of demand, it's only about 26, goes down a little bit just because there's more energy being consumed. But it's still the point that there's not a lot of hours where you are completely self-sufficient, even when you bring batteries in. Yes, it is better than wasting that energy, for sure. But it's the point that by no means during the entire year are you self-sufficient. It's only, 20 to 30% of the time are you self-sufficient. And from a resiliency standpoint, the real question is, are all of these hours contiguous, or are they sort of spread out over the course of the year? So in terms of the resiliency value, that's really something to think about. Right. Right. Well, and I will get to that exactly. So if you sort of look at this as sort of where does the whole supply of electricity come from? Again, the vast majority is coming from imported generation. You've got, some on-island generation, but you also have these batteries that are providing power across the board. And so to your point, Dave, on a seasonal basis, right? Summer has the most hours with no imported energy. Sun is blooming out. It's wonderful. You're getting all this energy being produced. But then we look at what I actually thought was more interesting was comparing fall to spring. Because I feel like from a solar irradiation standpoint, the amount of sun, you're probably going to get roughly the same amount of sun in the fall as you are in the spring. So what would explain the differences between them is on the demand side, in that the demand for electricity is typically higher in the fall. You've got folks coming, sticking around towards the end of the season, enjoying fall. I feel like fall is the greatest time to be, Block Island, Cape Cod. That's usually where I go. But it's a great time to be in this part of the world. And so you still have a number of folks on the island consuming electricity that they aren't there in the spring. Yes.
Very simplistically, everybody that lives here in the spring knows you don't put a colorway until Memorial Day.
Exactly.
Spring is more, it's colder.
Right.
Just like sitting in Fenway Park before it warms up.
Exactly. Yep. Yep.
I think that's my easy explanation.
Yep. I think that's it as well. Yeah.
Or it becomes a lower percentage.
Because there is just so much, in terms, they all go, yeah.
In the established goal, there's higher demand, so percentage.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. And we also talked about, again, if you're buying all this electricity, then from a cost standpoint, again, we didn't take into account infrastructure costs to enable all these resources on the island. But if you just look at the supply costs, we've got to buy all this electricity, whether it's here on the island or it's off island. 60 to 80% of those costs that we modeled are going to come from your purchase power and market purchases. So they are still comprising the vast majority of the cost the utility still has to incur.
I've been having being a little dense.
Not at all.
The 30%, 50%, 90%, what is it?
Oh yeah, so these just represent whether it's roof. Sorry, good question. See, these are all great. This is why I do this ahead of time before I send you the report so we can work out all the kinks. These represent the level of rooftop penetration. Yep. Yeah, sorry about that.
Pete, I didn't answer the question, Chris's question very well with how the purchases, PPAs work.
Okay.
So we have some contracts, Chris, like Gravel Pit Solar, First Light, NIPA. We take what they produce, we pay what they produce. And then we have the Shell contract today that's going to be replaced by Brookfield, starting in November. Those have some built-in variability into them. So what Energy New England does is they look at today's load, they look at tomorrow's forecast, they factor in solar forecast as well, and then they put a bid into the ISO New England market the day before. And then that's what we pay on is the bid. The difference between the bid and actual real-time load is spot market. So if we ask for, let's just say we ask for 80, we only use 70, we have to sell 10, vice versa. Yeah.
You're bidding on price and amounts, or just bidding?
Quantity. Yeah, we bid on quantity, we pay a fixed price per megawatt.
Okay. I think this may be the second. So we can also convert all those supply costs and normalize them on sort of a retail rate metric, cents per kilowatt hour. And we can look at how they vary across, established goals and our 3 different levels of rooftop solar versus community solar within the curtailment case, within the batteries case for each one of these. And so that's really what this represents, is going across all of the scenarios. There's technically 3, 6, 9, 12. Yeah. So this is 3 scenarios, 3 scenarios, 3 scenarios, 3 scenarios. And the point I really want to make with this is, this goes from about 7 cents up to 10 cents. There's some variability there, but it's not dramatically different. And even within those different levels of trade-off between community scale versus rooftop solar, you see that the differences the range in levels aren't that big. So to me, the whole point of this is the range in the scenario-driven costs are relatively minimal, and they don't differ dramatically from one case to another. Now, again, there are infrastructure costs that we have not taken into account that would need to be added to this. So this is not the only cost that would be incurred, and those would need to be added onto this. And again, depending on community scale versus just the rooftop solar, you may find some differences again, but this is all up at the utility level to sort of determine. But from this standpoint, current supply costs, you said around 11 cents, right, per kilowatt hour? Yeah. Okay, 6 cents.
One other thing too, I'll just throw out here, and this is for everybody to consider, including our commissioners. Tony Pappas remembers we did a study on batteries about 4 years ago, 2020, 2021. And we couldn't size a battery small enough to be economical. They kept coming back to me as like, we give up. We can't, the economics don't work, period, no matter what size. In the future, you have to put a price on resiliency, right? So we were just looking at the economics. We were looking at, smoothing out solar. We were looking at energy arbitrage, you buy cheap, sell high, that kind of a thing. In the future, you have to put a price tag on resiliency, and you have to figure out what it's worth to you. And as we start to do, RFPs for community solar, we're also going to include an RFP for a storage along with that. And as you do the analysis of the RFP and the prices that come back, you have to make some tough decisions. Commissioners have to make some tough decisions on, what resiliency is worth.
So some colleagues of mine at Berkeley just finished up some analysis looking at long duration outages. What you typically see in the industry is a lot of analysis and understanding of short duration outages, an hour, 2 hours, 4 hours. But when you're talking about undersea cable going out for 2 days, a week, several weeks, months at a time, et cetera, there has not to this point been really robust analysis to understand that resiliency value of avoiding these long duration outages. And so some colleagues of mine just finished up some analysis and published it. And it's a great resource. It's based on some work in other islands around Puerto Rico, Guam, et cetera. I think they've also done some mainland work as well. So I think you've got a nice resource to use to begin to sort of understand what that resiliency value looks like. Yeah, Dave. Yeah.
The cost of resiliency, value of the resiliency is very high. So I think those studies should reflect that. But I actually have another question. On the futuristic report that Lawrence does on energy storage, can you just comment if they look at capacitors?
Ooh, yeah, again, I'm the energy, not the, I'm not an engineer, I'm the economist. And it's also NREL's product, not Berkeley Labs product. So it's that other lab. I don't talk about them.
Incorporate capacity.
Okay.
Adding tools, that's very bucks.
Yeah.
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 Would y'all be able to share that study y'all did on battery?
Yeah, absolutely. I forget the company's name. Tony, you remember the company? They're based out of Austin, Texas. One other thing too, I don't know how we're doing on time, but I just want to throw this out there too. So when we talk about resiliency and the price of storage and the price of all that, you have to also factor in the fact that we're a little bit different because we have full generation backup. And then you have to put a price tag on emissions. You have to put a price tag on environmental costs. You have to put a price tag on all that. So the analysis that we start to get into gets pretty complicated, but it's worth doing. And as we do, and I think we'll probably go out, to bid for a community solar project. As we do the analysis on the battery, we'll get some help and we'll figure out what those costs would be. And then it's up to you, the community, to figure out if it's worth an extra penny a kilowatt hour or half a cent a kilowatt hour or 5 cents a kilowatt hour. It's up to the members to figure that out, who are represented by the commissioners.
Yeah.
Very focused on solar, and you mentioned wind, but you weren't into wind.
Yeah.
But we do have this, 30 megawatt wind farm.
Yeah.
Sitting off the island that I think the purchase agreement is up before 2040 that exists.
Okay.
So is there consideration of how, like an opportunity for Block Island to be getting power
We didn't,
from that wind farm by 2050?
yeah, I mean, we didn't model it, but I think it's a great question for you in terms of whether that's, what options exist.
Yeah, so that is something to consider. I'm doing the math in my head, not sure when that comes up, but there'll probably be we're about 2035. Yeah, so that time will come. The one thing that they'll do is they'll look at repowering the turbines, and if it's cost effective, they'll do it. But that will also come with a sales opportunity for them, and they'll reach out to everybody. And I can tell you that I wish that we had some offshore wind in our portfolio because it does work. The problem with the Block Island project, it was super expensive. We got the benefit from the cable. The new project that's being built, it's the prices are starting to come down. I would hope by 2035 that the prices would start to be, more competitive. If there's enough of it, it definitely will be. But we look at all different, resources, and the closer to home, the better, especially if it's located off our coast, because then we don't pay transmission to get it here.
Exactly.
So,
Exactly.
but
So I mentioned this earlier, so how do you begin to make trade-offs between the level of rooftop solar versus community scale solar? And, as we talked about before, you have to pay the community solar for curtailment. So that may be one reason why you might want to avoid community scale solar. But on the flip side, as I also mentioned, the utility has a much better opportunity to drive a level of adoption for community solar that it really doesn't have for rooftop solar. Now, could you create more economic signals for investment in rooftop solar? Sure. You as a community can ultimately decide sort of what that looks like between those two things. But even if you do create those economic signals, the point is, which of these might you have more control over? An RFP for community scale solar, or refine the economic impact, the economic opportunities for the rooftop solar. But that's really, to me, sort of what the trade-offs are associated with them, is largely sort of economics and dependability of adoption. Last but not least is there are these two levels of demand that we talked about, and the adoption of all these different resources different measures in terms of energy efficiency, electric vehicles, all of those, as I mentioned, based on current adoption levels, are relatively low. To get to these established goals is going to probably is definitely going to cost some money. You know, you're going to have to incentivize folks to want to adopt in those more. You're going to bring down the cost of them. You have to deal with potentially some labor issues, is my understanding. So there are just things you need to be more deliberate about if you want to achieve those established goals. And they're likely to drive increased costs to some degree. But with all of that additional demand for electricity, you're taking all these fixed costs and you're spreading it over a larger base. So yes, the numerator in that dollar per kilowatt hour is going to go up, but the denominator in it is going to go up even more. And so what you see is that the cents per kilowatt hour, the rate that you pay, actually goes down as you move to those established goals. So there's some economic benefit associated with having those lower rates to offset sort of the broader or the increased costs that come with it in total. So that's back to my key takeaways. So to reiterate, y'all can hit 100% renewable energy through a portfolio of on-island and off-island resources. Although you can meet 100% of your maximum demand for electricity, it's only going to provide 45%, at most 45% of your energy needs during the year. And in less than 30% of the hours, even with battery storage, are you completely self-reliant on the island with on-island resources. From an affordability standpoint, again, based on the cost that we included, there's not a lot of variability across the scenarios, and it's not that different than sort of current supply costs. And when we talk about the trade-offs between rooftop and community solar, as I said, it's largely about dependability of adoption and the economic costs of curtailment to the degree to which you have that. And then being pretty deliberate about, if you really want to achieve these higher levels of demand to bring down the overall rate, you're going to have to be very deliberate about addressing some of the reasons why those current programs have not been as successful as you might want. Okay, so with that, any other questions? I have not answered. This is my dog, Wally. Any other questions I have not been able to answer? Yeah, Dave.
Begs the question of evaluating the economics of more storage versus curtailment versus the cost of a power contract, and which is the more optimal. And I know you didn't model that because that's going to be very difficult how to scope of this project, but I think that's what we have to do is come up with a way of looking at what our indigenous supply is, whether it's more solar or more storage or maybe low building versus the economics of purchasing the power from off-island paying all the transmission costs.
So I think to me, this is a multi-dimensional issue, right? And that's why I laid this out in this way, because it's an issue. I mean, sustainability is irregardless of which one. Your utility district is already getting you, 100% renewable forms of energy. So that's off the table. So it's really these issues here: self-reliance, resiliency, and affordability. And what is your intrinsic trade-off amongst those? How do you compare? Because if you want to be 100% self-reliant, you're going to have to put an awful lot of batteries on the island and find places to put them, and and have a system in place at the utility that can manage,
Well, that's used in these microgrid systems. We don't have, and that integration with what's going on right now, I think would be, one of the basic building blocks of any strategy. Because without that, it is to control it.
So Mike, sorry, yeah.
I was just going to add, Chris, so the study that we did, I think it was called Nexam. It wasn't Nexam, it's something else. But anyhow, the study that they did actually looked at that. And the thing that stuck out to me is we're talking big numbers. We're talking a lot of batteries. I did a back of the napkin drawing of what it would take to get us through the night, just through the night, 6 or 8 hours. And you'd fill up the soccer field with
Right.
big battery systems, huge numbers.
In my world, I think of cable failure, substation failure, catastrophic man-made or natural events and we're going to be using the generators.
Right.
And then more than the possible, but the externalities of using generators, you know what they are. And they're adding energy. Not knowing that.
I absolutely agree with you. I think the thing that sticks out, the thing that's hard for people to get their heads around is the amount of batteries that it would take to be meaningful for a cable outage. You know, you couldn't put enough batteries on this island to feed the cable or feed the island for a month, you know, without a cable or diesel generators.
Right, no.
That's a challenge.
Fuel, wind.
Right.
Solar, so yeah, you go for earlier is best.
I also think from the concept of resilience and self-reliance, and it sort of gets to the microgrid concept of, do you want the entire island to be self-reliant and the entire island to be resilient? Or are you willing to accept we need sort of these, dedicated emergency locations on the island where, you have power regardless of what happens in the broader island, but this part of the island, these, emergency buildings, et cetera, health facilities, whatever, like that's powered 100% of the time regardless. And it's on, let's say, renewable resources versus, diesel.
Wow.
Yep.
Through switching, the rural blackouts, power connections, in this, say, but the critical infrastructure from, I'll say, sanitary, critical, but always up to the school minutes. With Harvard, they're part of this. And five, so it's.
So I don't know the degree to which ETIP does repeat communities. I think there's been one example in the history of it, but I know that Martha's Vineyard looked at a microgrid, and they did the labs did a bunch of analysis to understand, where would you site the solar resource, the battery resources, electrically, where would you connect it? From regulatory and policy standpoint, are there rights of way you're moving over? I mean, all of that, I think, analysis went into an ETIP project, which isn't a grant. You're back in the world of technical assistance. So I think there are other options if that were to fall through, to potentially look for opportunities to get the kind of technical support you might want and need. Yeah, I think that's probably true. Other questions on the analysis?
On that tip point, we do have a community in Maine that is applying, that is exploring applying for this coming cohort of BTIP, and they completed BTIP 2 years ago.
Yeah. So it's again,
And it's
it can't hurt to put in for it, right? Worst thing to say is no, so.
That are big energy and island wide, and now they want to focus.
So in terms of next steps here, like I will make a couple of changes to sort of address titles and things like that to make sure that that's clear. Actually a prior version of this is already posted on the website. I will get the updated version of it out, so it gets posted by the end of the week. And then the technical report that's going to accompany this is going to probably be out in the July-August timeframe. I will admit, I just need to get to writing it. We do have a number of presentations that we've provided to the utility district on each piece of this analysis. So that has a lot more information about the inputs and assumptions that went into it. I'm happy, it's up to you if you want to make those available, but that's where, at least in the interim between now and when that full report comes out, that would be the next best source to sort of better understand some of those inputs and assumptions that went into this. So,
Pete, let me just get on my soapbox for a little bit. You want to make one point. If you weren't a utility district that was member owned, member governed, we wouldn't even be having these discussions. Okay, we're having discussions on resiliency and the best way to avoid running generators, the best way to explore and use renewable energy. Back in 2016, if this was still the Block Island Power Company, this wouldn't even have been studied. And I just want to applaud everybody in the island for turning this into a utility district, because without that, we wouldn't be doing this. And that's why I'm such a fan of the cooperative model across the country. You know, we serve close to 60% of the land mass. There's 900 co-ops across the country. The co-ops are the ones that are driving this type of technology transition. And for us, it's not about profit. You know, it's about resiliency. It's about all the things that you care about, not what I care about. It's about what you care about. And clearly, we don't like burning diesel, and we don't like the lights going out. We like price certainty. There's a whole bunch of things that we balance. But the Board of Commissioners, you know, I thank you guys for your work. The Board of Commissioners here, I thank for their, you know, for their inputs, and John for actually applying for the grant, getting the help. There's a lot of good that came out of this. And like I said, it reaffirmed some things that I knew, and it certainly opened my eyes on some other things. And listening to your presentation, every time I've done it, I go home like my head spinning, because there's so many different variables and pushes and pulls and things that, you know, you need to consider. So 6 o'clock, that's our 6 o'clock call.
All right.
I don't have anything else. Barbara, do you, Sean, Ken?
To just reinforce that last point you're making about the uniqueness of your co-op model, we have another ETIP project just down the way in Fishers Island, where two very active community members put in a proposal to be an ETIP community, but they really didn't have the support of the utility. It's a family-owned utility, much like it sounds like I think Block Island was, and we really struggled to get the attention of the utility, for the utility to see any value in what the community members wanted to do as part of the ETIP project. And so ultimately the ETIP project failed because we didn't have any buy-in or any interest on the part of the utility to consider the things that the community wanted. And so, yeah, to just give you a very tangible example of you know, exactly what he's talking about. You know, I also applaud you all for sort of going down this pathway.
I'll just share another experience with Fisher Island. So John, I think you went, Barbara went. We actually took a boat over there last summer, I think. Last summer, the summer before. We walked around, we walked away kind of shaking our heads, but I literally just got a phone call the other day. Tom knows it because it came into CRC, our call center, but we get phone calls from their residents probably 4, 5, 6 times a year, asking us for help in creating a member-owned utility district. And I always walk away like, okay, we had the discussion again, but I don't think it's going to go. So
Yeah.
I wish them the best of luck, and just consider yourselves lucky that you guys took the initiative to do this, because, you know, the cable was a game changer, the fiber is a game changer, and this utility is a game changer. We may not all like the policies that we set sometimes, but at least we have a voice. Okay.
Okay.
Peter, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
You mentioned the vineyard, and I don't know if Island program or Berkeley has looked at Nantucket at all. I see they recently applied for permitting for a third undersea cable. Have you guys been involved in any?
We've not been involved in that. Fishers Island is looking to put a third undersea cable in. They're looking to cost recovery from the state of New York for it. And that was one of the reasons the community members wanted to reach out to ETIP to understand, is there a better option here? And, you know, we basically said, look, we're not, you know, undersea cable engineering is definitely not our forte. We can develop a pro forma financial model of the utility and look at different options and understand what the financial implications are of putting the cable in versus other things to achieve some particular outcome. But like I said, the Fishers Island project unfortunately fell through. Nantucket has not applied to that I am aware of to any 4 cohorts. And I think there's been 2 projects on Martha's Vineyard, neither of which dealt with undersea cable stuff, but yeah. Yep. Okay. Thank you all for your time. You have no idea how much this means to me, all of you coming out, seeing the same faces every time. So thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah. Oh yeah, of course, Dave.